All right, so these videos are going to go over just a couple of parts of example one with the bank recs. Remember that we did a really elaborate bank rec with a handout where I had specific check numbers that were deposits in transit and outstanding checks and gave you a super detailed bank statement. This is just pieces of that. It's the same idea, just chunked and put into different problems or presented a slightly different way. So this first one with the um, this one is just like the reconciliation of the beginning balance of outstanding checks to the ending balance of outstanding checks that we did in the problem I mentioned. But let's look at it in this context. So the record, or first, let's kind of think about how the evolution or how outstanding checks change over time. So we have beginning outstanding checks, and this is, of course, the beginning of the month. The amount of checks that have not yet been deposited. Like we wrote this, remember that that's kind of pivotal with outstanding checks, is that we have credited cash when check was written, but the bank hasn't cleared this from our account yet, so the bank account isn't reduced. We reduced our books, but not the bank yet. Well, any more checks we write during the period are going to increase this amount. So the checks written by our company during the period will increase the amount of outstanding checks. Well, the bank will no doubt clear some of these checks, maybe some of these, a little bit of both. So checks deducted from our account. And I sort of describe this as they're cleared. They've cleared our account, right? They have, their impact has been taken out of our account, right? We have less money now. And then whatever is left over are still outstanding checks at the end of the period, which is typically a month. So the same thing is true with deposits in transit. The deposits in transit begin as a certain amount. I'll just call them DIT, the beginning balance of these. We have, for deposits in transit, we have debited the cash account when the check was received, but the bank has not yet put that into our account. It has not yet credited our account. And no doubt we're going to make more deposits. And we can subtract off because the bank will record the deposits that maybe some of them that were outstanding at the beginning of the period, some of these that we made. So this is the deposits recorded by the bank, and this is ending balance of my deposits in transit. Okay, so that's all we're doing in this problem. Really, we get the beginning balances here, 15,000 and 25. Outstanding checks, deposits in transit. If you're not really understanding what this data table was saying, then you weren't really understanding what an outstanding check is. Because checks cleared, well, that applies to the bank, or checks written, that applies to the books during the month. So we're just getting the information to basically fill out this equation. We start with 15,000. It doesn't really need an equation because, it follows sense that, hey, these checks have not yet been deposited by the people we wrote them to. The 15,000, they haven't cleared my account yet. Um, and that's where we start. Well, we as the company wrote 32,000 of these. So our book records show that we wrote 32,000. Well, that's going to increase the number of checks that could potentially be outstanding. I say potentially because then the bank recorded $40,000 of checks being taken out of our account. So that's going to reduce the number of outstanding checks to 7,000. This is the imbalance. All right. Do the same thing with deposits in transit. They begin at 25. Well, the book recorded 50,000 deposits being made during the period. And the bank showed a credit to our account for 64,000. So we're taking those away, not because it has a negative effect on our account, but because the deposits are no longer in transit if the bank recorded them. And so that leaves us with 11,000 ending balance of DIT. Now, note in the key that it does miss, it's a typo, and I went with it in the math. It shows this as 68,000. It should be 64,000. All right, so now we have our ending balance of these two pieces. We can apply that to the bank balance to figure out what the post-reconciliation balance, the true balance of this account is. So when I say post-reconciliation, it's the same thing because that's really, after all these checks clear, how much will be in our account. Remember, this is the information that the bank doesn't have in its bank statement, and we're starting at the ending bank balance. Don't start at the beginning of the month's bank balance. That's irrelevant at this point. We're working to see, all right, the bank says we have this much, but because we know the checks we wrote, we know how much is truly available. And we know that these are going to clear eventually. And we know these will also be recorded eventually. So our bank account will move 7,000 down once the outstanding checks clear. Once go up by 11,000 once the deposits are recorded. And that will net 320,000. Right, so that's the first problem. The second problem is really the same idea. The only difference is now we're not just looking at reconciling the bank's end of the month balance, but we're actually kind of hooking it around into the book balance as well. So this is the bank statement and it has my beginning of the month balance, my end of the month, right? These are the deposits they recorded, not in transit. The checks that my company wrote, Bailey, that have been processed and reduced from my account, and the interest revenue, the convenience fees, and an insufficient funds check. So we do an examination of the books. We find that at the during November, determined there was a balance of total outstanding check balance of 23,000 and deposits in transit of $37,000 at the end of the month. All right, so end of the month, which means if it's the end of the month, we don't have to worry about doing this reconciliation forward to get to the end of the month because we want to use that end of the month information and apply it to our bank balance at the end of the month. So it says determine the true balance of the cash account for Bailey. What it's saying is, all right, the bank's telling me I have this, but if I have this many outstanding checks, that's going to reduce my account when the bank records them and debits my account. And it'll increase by 37,000 when the deposits in transit are recorded. So we're adjusting that end of period bank balance by what we know will clear and what we know will be deposited. So overall, it will increase it $14,000 up to $316,150. All right, provide the end of month book balance. Well, this is a post-rec balance. But the post-rec balance of the bank has to equal the post-bank, no, sorry, the post-book balance. because post-recs are really true cash balances and they must equal each other between the two. That's the whole point of reconciling. So we know we're going to get 316, 150 when we adjust the books for all the appropriate items. And these are the things that the books had not recorded yet that they only get from the bank statement. So they will subtract the insufficient funds check to get to 316, 150. They'll subtract the $200 service fee to get to that amount. And we'll add that $3,250 of interest revenue. Remember, these are the things that the books didn't know about. When I say they don't know, they're not yet recorded. And so we have a balance and we make those adjustments we get here. Well, we just got to solve for that beginning balance, working everything backwards. So we take the 316, 150 and add the 1200, add the 200, and subtract the 3250 of interest. And that walks us backwards to a book balance of 314, 300. Now, the final piece is, this highlights what we have to record now because this was not yet recorded. But when performing the reconciliation, we found it. And so now we record all these items. So we have, remember, fees are you just describe them as fees. They reduce net income. They're an expense, but just a specific name for a very generic specific name for an expense. Fees. We also have interest revenue. Of 3,250. And that, of course, will increase net income. And we have an insufficient funds check. Well, the fees are a reduction of our account balance. So that's going to credit cash. The interest revenue, of course, increases our cash balance at the bank, was not recorded in the books, and now we record it. The insufficient funds check. Now think about it this way. If someone gave me a check for $1,200 and hey, then I got a check, right? As the company, I would debit cash for 1,200, take it to the bank, still have that debited as cash because I got a check. The bank says, whoops, insufficient funds. You don't get this money. Well, then we need to get our cash account credited because we recorded a check that was no good. So we need to adjust the cash account appropriately. And if someone's paying us with a check, most likely it's an account receivable that they were trying to pay off. But when we received that check, we debited cash, we would have credited the receivable. But now we know that they still owe us this money and we debit accounts receivable to put it back into that non-payment, but expecting payment status. And that's really the two examples. The third one is pretty much the same. It goes a little deeper and kind of gets you to work through this portion. It starts you off basically working the rec like we did here, the reconciliation, but then takes it a little bit further by analyzing what must have been the checks written by the bank or by the company, or sorry, the checks recorded by the bank and the checks written by the company.